Video games. Millions of people play them. People gather everywhere around the world to come and celebrate this thing that they love, that is gaming. For me, my interest in games primarily sprouts from the ability to assume the role of another entity, to see how well I can deal with the problems of that world. Whether it's building up an army to destroy another person, making sure that a family that I created lives to see their dreams achieved, or using a cat as a silencer for a weapon, it's the experience that we get from these worlds that makes them so intriguing. There are a lot of underrated factors, however, that can really prove to be extremely important to the game's overall quality. Some of the most important parts of making a virtual existence enjoyable in a world come down to a few basic things. Firstly, the game has to feel natural. It has to be paced in a nice way. The game has to appropriately spread the content in an even layer of things to do so that it's interesting and enjoyable for the player, not tedious and mind-numbing. In order to maintain interest for a long time, a game has to make sure it doesn't separate its content too thinly. The immersion of a game is another important aspect, and it coincides with the pacing closely. The world needs to feel like the events that occur in it are believable, and also that everything that you did was entirely your effort, not your character just deciding he didn't need you anymore and does like half the work for you. This is also related to difficulty and the learning curve of the game. A game isn't going to be fun if the difficulty spikes in outrageous twists and turns. In my opinion, a learning curve needs to be a bit steep but not a cliff that is so difficult right from the start that people get turned away when they start trying to play it. But it can't be too gentle of a slope either. Like Plants vs Zombies, which has such a good learning curve, it's so smooth that the game is prevented from ever really getting difficult. This goes on to the topic of boss fights. These are meant to be the climaxes of the game, so they have to be really satisfying. And you want to know that it was you that owned the boss. Bosses have to correspond with the learning curve of the game. They should be the main spikes of difficulty, but in a fair way. How to make it fair? Easy. You just base the boss of the main mechanic in the game that drove the rest of the difficulty. In Super Meat Boy, it was extreme precision, patience, and reaction time that would get you to the boss finish, excluding World 4. In most Zelda games, you have to make use of mobility, appropriate dodges or blocks, and positioning and reaction time. These things were basically what made the whole games hard, and they kick them into overdrive when it comes into boss fights. There's usually a way to go backwards with this though, and that can, and usually does, ruin the fight. Quicktime events. Apparently Quicktime events started, and I'm not gonna claim that I'm any history guy, but around 96 with Die Hard Arcade, but then continued upon in 99 with Shenmue, and it was praised for it at the time, but I'll be honest, I've only ever really seen gameplay of those games, so I can't really speak anecdotally here. However, it's probably easy to realize that in today's gaming market, QTEs have only become tiresome and invasive. Don't get me wrong, I can sometimes appreciate the quick times are satisfying, like to simulate the effort that the character puts into doing something, but only in moderation. When your game begins to just use them as an excuse to make a cinematic experience with little to no control over the character, that's when there's a problem. And unless your game revolves around quick times in a big way, such as Heavy Rain or Indigo Prophecy, it ruins the difficulty curve, and worst of all, the immersion. My biggest problem is when developers use quick times as a main form of boss fighting material. Picture it, you're nearing the antagonist, you're ready to fight that bastard, you've been training yourself the entire game so that you can be certain that you're good enough to beat this guy. Then you walk in, and you see him, and he charges you, and you can't move, and just sit there. And then you see the prompt. Left click, spacebar, E, right click. Oh no. All the while, your character's just going to town on that guy. He's like bashing his head in. He's like kicking him in the nuts, throwing him out of buildings, stabbing him 40 times in the stomach. Then the boss falls. Yeah, I did it. There is no satisfaction in doing that. This is, among other reasons, why Battlefield 3's campaign was especially bad for me. Okay, look, I get it. Yeah, the campaign had so many other things wrong with it, but the ending encounter with the main enemy was just me watching my character whoop some ass while I occasionally press a button. And then the guy died, and the credit rolled, and I was like, oh wow, that was a pretty good ending to a first-person shooter! This was the same problem I encountered with Far Cry 3. The game is all about shooting people, stabbing people, and remaining stealthy. Yeah, it's always up to the player and which killer they want to be, but the playstyles can cross over to the point where you're just an all-round badass that kills everything using guns and stealth by the end. You practice that the entire game until the encounter with your first main enemy. And he's the guy you saw in the front of the game case, and you thought, oh my god, I can't wait to give him some of this. And then you get there, and then, look, I'll admit, the encounter is pretty epic. It's emotional, and the music is awesome. But the fight is just you fighting hallucinated versions of him with epic music in the background. Then you walk up to him, press F, and then watch your character kill him. Thematically, the fight feels awesome and looks cool. It's appropriately emotional and meaningful to the player and the character, but there was barely a struggle between the player and him. It's impossibly easy and involves shooting a bit followed by a canned animation of a kill. And you can't even run out of bullets, so there's virtually no way to fail. It's satisfying to watch him be killed like that, and the music makes it a meaningful experience. But it's so short! You're doing the entire game to that point to find and kill him, to reach an extremely one-sided battle that lasts about what feels like 90 seconds. Hours of playtime to reach something so easy is not satisfying to kill. The game could have made it satisfyingly emotional and difficult to overcome as well. If the fight had a lot more content, it could have been way more epic. It could have been shooting at Vaas, stealth and flanking in order to get to him. Then when you finally get to him, initiated a takedown on him, he resisted, stabbed you back, and then it initiated the fight we currently have. That would be way better in my opinion. Rather than you mowing down a handful of people and walking into a room just to have him jump out from a crevice and stab you, that's not a struggle, that's just confusing. There was no feeling of, finally, I get to kill him, it's all over. It was just, press F, okay, cool, I'm done here. There wasn't any feeling of, I outplayed an insane mastermind in fair combat, because you didn't ever come to a point in the game where you faced him fully conscious and had a gun in hand. The final antagonist of the game was just as bad, but with more button pushes. You go in, press some buttons in a tense situation, go into the fight, adhere to the quick times, and holy shit, everyone in the room is dead. I just came out of that fight thinking, oh, I'm glad I chose all the right weapons and upgraded all my gear and specialized in stealth gameplay and got a scope on my gun for the fight with the enemy, which was just a bunch of quick times. I mean, look, I understand the fight was supposed to showcase a lot of the psychological issues that the character was having, but this isn't challenging, and it's definitely not satisfying. It's difficult for the character, but it's not for the player. It feels so impersonal and way too easy. Modern Warfare 2 did the exact same thing. You just watched your character wrench a knife out of your belly and then toss it at the enemy, then he dies. It's satisfying for the character because the character had to work for the victory. However, the player had to overcome the odds that stood against him pressing the right buttons. As less of a problem, it happened in Resident Evil 4, in a cinematic where you first see the main antagonist. It's not a challenge, it's just plain annoying. Either have control of the character during story parts, or have a normal cutscene leading into an encounter, not some halfway abomination. Other examples, like Naruto Storm 2 and Knight's Contract, revolve around quick times a silly amount. Knight's Contract was an awful game for other reasons, but the fact that you had to muster through half-interesting boss fight, then to be faced with quicktime events one after another, just made it a kick in the face. And yes, there are some good examples of quicktime events. In God of War, it's very similar to Knight's Contract, but you go through a huge chunk of combat first that is satisfying and awesome before finishing off the monster by mashing a button repeatedly for a final exertion of pure lust for the death of your foe. It's really satisfying to have to work to corner your enemy into a position where you've got him and you can just scream DIE while raping your controller. Quicktimes will probably work well if your game revolves around them too, like in Heavy Rain. The whole game does quicktime events and it's basically just that. From the start you're doing them and you don't stop until the end. There's really nothing else to the game, so appropriately in very intense situations, the quicktime events prove to feel like just another part of the game, and are done so in such a way that it doesn't feel unfair or takes skill out of the game. You've been trying to get better at them the entire game, so when something hardcore happens, it's fine to have difficult quicktimes. A game going from FPS to QuickTimes in a big way would be like during the Scott Shelby fight in Heavy Rain, it just turns into Soul Calibur. Or when your character picks up a gun, it just turns into a third-person cover-based shooter. That wouldn't be fun, that'd just be annoying. QuickTimes in moderation can definitely help the experience in other games too. Take Zelda, Twilight Princess for example. After what might be my favorite cinematic sequences of battles in a Zelda game, you're led to just a one-on-one fight with Ganondorf, and there's a quick time in that. However, it's at the end of the fight, is not unfair, and doubles as a demonstration of the contrast between Link and Ganondorf. Not only that, you don't even need to do the quick time to defeat him. There's a quick time event that's only there for the cinematic purpose of the game, and doesn't impede the experience in any way whatsoever. There are countless great games that include satisfying boss encounters that don't have any quick time events. The ones that stand out to me are Metroid Prime, Dark Souls, The Witcher 2, and World of Warcraft. Someone out there was probably really angry at me about saying that World of Warcraft is satisfying, but from the time that I played, there was nothing more satisfying than working with 4 to 39 other people in order to function like a well-oiled machine after many hours of work to destroy a boss. It's that sort of satisfaction that just requires raw persistence and effort that you just couldn't get in any other way. You knew that in most cases, it was the faults of your group that led to your deaths, and when you didn't die, you knew for sure that you nailed it. As a solution to the problem, I feel it's best that people are just able to widely realize that there's a line that can be crossed when using QuickTime events, between cinematic addition and cumbersome, uninvolved tedium. Once this fine line is defined and accepted by many, it will be easier for developers to choose a path of combat that is less scripted. There will always be times when QuickTime events are necessary, such as to translate the extreme hatred that the player has towards enemies into a game at the end of a long, difficult boss battle, in my opinion. However, final encounters with enemies that involve you watching the character go whoop some guy's ass as you occasionally press shift to dodge out of a punch should not serve a place in video games that are mainly shooters, as it breaks difficulty and immersion. There is always a better alternative to QuickTime events in video games, and in my opinion, they should be for the most part removed from future games as full-length boss mechanics. Thanks for not closing the video. If you have any comments on how bad you thought I did at communicating points, please let me know by leaving a post. And if you think this was an okay video, give us a like.